Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. We're coming to you on a Tuesday morning from downtown Los Angeles. We've got a lot to cover from last night, which is Penn State's Rose Bowl victory over Utah, 35-21. Very impressive and ultimately a lot of separation in this matchup against the Pac-12 champions. An 11th win for this Nittany Lions squad. We are fresh out of Monday night interviews with Penn State head coach James Franklin, the offensive MVP Sean Clifford, defensive MVP Jair Brown, and several other members of this roster, a few of whom are moving on, a few of whom have decisions to make. And let's face it, we don't have all the facts right now in terms of the roster decisions that are still to come. Go over to Lions247.com. We are not flying on a Tuesday, so if news pops, we're in a pretty good spot. But we'll have a podcast up later in the week. We'll probably have some conversations about that then. But fellas, Mark Brennan, Daniel Gallen joining me here. Let's focus on what we witnessed in game number 13 on the 2022-2023 schedule. Mark, pretty emphatic fashion in Penn State getting to an 11-2 finish.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I liked is that the two MVPs of the game for Penn State, Sean Clifford and Jair Brown, they kind of personified what this team was all about. You know, you get into a season, where you lose a couple games midway through, and it could have gone a bunch of different ways. And I think the leadership of this team, you have two captains; those are two of the captains. The leadership overall took over. For me, I thought it was great to see Sean Clifford play the way he did. He wasn't just a game manager. He went out there, he made great decisions, checked him into stuff, checked him out of stuff. I'm sure Yurcich was helping over on the sideline. But that was, we were talking before the game. Has he had a signature win yet? He's had some great performances, but he's not necessarily had great performances against teams of this caliber. And this was it. In his final game of a long career, he is able to have that sort of performance. In terms of Tig Brown, I thought he was robbed. We talked about it not being, at least first or second team All Big Ten. He was third team. I think he felt he had to make a statement, and he went out there and made a statement. Intercepting a pass, 1.5 sacks, doing the stuff that he led the team in tackles. One of the things that I think hurt him in terms of not winning All Big Ten, first team All Big Ten notice, is that he was so versatile, was that they did so many different things with him in that Prowler package that maybe the numbers in specific areas didn't grab your eye. But I think people fail to realize what he did across the board, and he did it again. And, the other thing that really jumped out to me, the halftime adjustments. I mean, I thought on both sides of the ball, they came out, and I thought they played well in the first half, okay in the first half, but I just thought the halftime adjustments were terrific. They didn't get a sack until late in the first half, and they came out. I guess an argument could be made, what would have happened if Cam Rising was okay? But my thought is that they were starting to get that pass rush dialed in. And the other thing is, knock on wood, let's hope Cam Rising is okay. But I think when you're running that much against this defense, you're really putting yourself in harm's way. So it was sad to see him get banged up. We always like to see the great players stay out there for both teams. But ultimately, two key players stepping up, a bunch of other veterans doing good things, the opt-ins, and then the halftime adjustments were tremendous.
You mentioned Rising. He finished the game 8 of 21 passing, 95 yards, had a touchdown, had an interception. Seemed like the way the game was starting to trend was that he was going to continue taking those physical licks, the defensive rotation that we talked about all season long with Penn State, the way they can filter guys in, especially in that front seven. That's going to wear down an offensive front. And it just felt like, to me, they did have some nice moments from that backfield. Jackson in particular with that touchdown run, rumbled through 3 or 4 arm tackles. Penn State was not tackling well throughout the first half of this game. Not necessarily something that's unique when teams step aside from live action for a month. Sometimes it takes that moment, but ultimately just didn't feel like they were prepared to match Penn State from a playmaker standpoint. And from the Nittany Lions perspective, Daniel, Sean Clifford has been the trigger man for so long. This was start number 46. It's his job, and he always tells us it's his job to get the ball in the hands of guys who make it happen. They relied on the big play in a way that we hadn't necessarily seen them do over the course of this year. But let's start with the quarterback, because you wrote about him. You woke up bright and early in Los Angeles to do a national radio hit about Clifford, because the dynamics have changed versus where we were coming out of October to where we are starting January. he's rewritten the narrative a little bit as he put the finishing touches on his story.
Yeah, I mean, like Mark said, Sean was someone who came into this game without really that signature win on his resume. He'd never beaten Ohio State. Those Michigan games at this point were a long time ago. One was during COVID. And he really came out last night and did what he needed to do and just did it really well. I mean, obviously, the big plays stand out. An 88-yarder to Keandre Lambert-Smith, which was just a really, really nicely executed play in the backfield with the play fake, then the little half pump fake, letting Lambert-Smith get open in the space and then delivering a perfect ball. But I thought that the drive in the first half that ended with the 10-yard touchdown pass to Mitchell Tinsley, I think that was a version of Clifford that we hadn't really seen that much this year in terms of the assertiveness and really just putting the ball in some tight windows. He had that 20-yard completion to Harrison Wallace on third down. I believe it was third down to move the chains. Just a very, very nice ball. On the first touchdown drive, he hit Theo Johnson up the seam for 28 yards. Another really good throw and catch, taking advantage of what Utah was giving them right there. I just thought Clifford really rose to the occasion. He looked the part of a big-time quarterback on the big stage. I know a lot of Penn State fans would have liked to see that more often than maybe it happened over the past 4 years, but I think that he leaves with a win, and it can be kind of hard to talk about legacy, and this conversations can get a little tired, but I think given what he has accomplished in his career, he has something tangible now to go with those numbers. It's not a Big Ten title. It's not a national championship. It's not a college playoff berth, but it is a win in the Rose Bowl. And I think that's a very nice and just kind of cool thing to have on your resume.
Let's remember where we were October 22nd back in Beaver Stadium when Sean Clifford was hearing the boos. And I mean, if you hadn't picked up on it, that pissed off a lot of people in Penn State's facilities. And maybe that was part of the reason why they were able to kind of rally and get to the finish line strong. Of course, after the Ohio State matchup where you can easily point and spotlight those turnovers as a determining factor and how the game was lost control of by Penn State in the fourth quarter. But Clifford here down the stretch played some of the better football we've seen from him. Those matchups were not intimidating in November, but you would look at how he finished out in Beaver Stadium the last couple of games as well. 35 of 46 against Michigan State and Utah combined. That's a 76% completion percentage the last couple of games. 481 yards through the air, 6 touchdowns, no turnovers, and I think most importantly, against the Utah defense that a lot of people respected coming into this game, particularly Penn State's coaching staff. When you look at how he performed, he was anticipatory against the defense that has really had its way with some impressive quarterbacks, or at least over the course of games was able to wear down some quarterbacks. Seemed like he knew what their next step was going to be, had an answer for it pre-snap, and also just watching him kind of evade pressure. This wasn't a clean game for him in the pocket. And I thought even as he was under duress, Mark Brennan, what we saw from him was a quarterback who was under control. And it seems like he was the catalyst of sorts. There's probably a few to point to, including Tig Brown, PJ Musfer. They were locked in this month, and they checked that off just like we thought they might. We all picked Penn State. I think a big part of that was we were gravitating toward the buy-in. And Sean Clifford, the way he played with a month to prepare, sure seems like a guy who was fully prepared whatever Utah wanted to toss his way. Cam Rising aside, Utah's defense didn't have answers.
Yeah, I thought there was a play, and I forget exactly when it was, when Clifford just barely avoided being sacked and then rolled out and hit Keandre Lambert-Smith. As impressive as the long touchdown was, that's when you got to feel like, okay, he's really on his game. One thing James Franklin said after the game that I thought, kind of resonated with me is that Utah played a lot of cover zero. So I think what that was telling you is that they were daring Sean Clifford to beat them, and they weren't sure that he could. And ultimately, well, guess what? He was able to do it and do it pretty effectively. And again, I don't think you could, and we had an opportunity to talk to Drew Aller at Media Day, whatever day that was, because they're all running together at this point. And, when he talked about what he learned from Sean Clifford, part of it is leadership, part of it's the way you handle yourself, but part of it is making those decisions at the line of scrimmage. And, you needed a veteran to do that against that team. I was one of the guys who said they probably should have started Allard during that Minnesota game. And as I look back at it, I was wrong. And I'm not too proud to say that, because I don't know that they come out of the I don't want to call it a mess, but you lose 2 games in 3 weeks, and they're the defining games of the season.
Mm.
And, my thought at that time is, maybe it is time to turn the page. But you know what? The coaches stuck with him. The players stuck with him. Drew Aller stuck with him. And ultimately, I think the fans stuck with him, as it kind of went on, and they saw the way that he was playing. And then with respect to the opt-ins, we said it throughout this week. The vibe here from the players was so tremendously different than last year, and understandably so. I mean, it was a crappy season last year. They're coming off 2 crappy seasons. The Outback Bowl is a very good bowl, but obviously it wasn't resonating with the players. And just to have all of those players who are going into the NFL draft, whether they're in their final year of eligibility, whether they're giving up their final year, I think says something. And I also thought it was pretty cool that Joey Porter showed up. I mean, listen, I understand his decision. I wonder if he regrets it at this point. I know he won't regret it when he's signing a, however long contract. But the fact that he was there, I think, speaks to the fact that, I mean, the collective buy-in from this team, I just think was something. And I didn't get a chance to ask James Franklin a question or Clifford and Jair Brown at the podium, because it was very limited. But one thing I would like to ask them at some point is, your legacy is one thing, but what about where you left this program? Given where it was last year, given where it was at the end of October, this could have gone a lot of different ways. This could have gone a lot of different ways for James Franklin in terms of, we know how long his contract is, but I mean, in terms of the buy-in from fans. And these veterans, they prevented it from going in a lot of different ways. So I think I think that's big. And I was disappointed I didn't get an opportunity to ask that, but I bet you they're extremely proud of what they were able to do and where they left this program.
Yeah, I just was going to say, I don't think it's just the last 2 years, but when we talked to PJ Mustipher in late November, he reflected on what they had anticipated for their careers coming in 2018 as members of that class. And, quickly looking back at it, it's a top 5 unit. PJ Mustipher's left from that class. Most of the guys have moved on. A bunch of them are making millions of dollars in the NFL. Nick Tarburton's one of them who's moving on. But he said they thought they'd leave with some Big Ten rings. I mean, they were coming in very quickly after a couple 11-win seasons, 2 years, a year and a half removed from winning a Big Ten championship. And I know that's to have that empty cupboard in terms of Big Ten titles or college football playoff appearances. It's a tough thing for a guy like PJ to internalize. But what he said rolling forward was, when you hand off that baton now and you step away, they feel like they're in a really exciting place. And he said it. He said, quote, "I'll be pissed if these guys don't win Big Ten championships, don't get that college football playoff appearance." And Daniel, we can go in a lot of different directions, and I want to talk about some of the guys that Sean Clifford was looking toward. First off, if you had a thought picking up on where Mark left it, let's go there. But secondarily, Nick Singleton is kind of that figure, one of those figures that represent the future here, who was on display in Pasadena.
Yeah, I would just go back to some of the things that Jair Brown was saying back in November when Penn State was going for its ninth win, going for its 10th win. And he was really reflecting on his time leading into senior day, because he's someone who he got here in 2020. So he is coming in on the heels of the 3 11-win seasons in 4 years, the Cotton Bowl. And then his first 2 years, he didn't even get a taste of any of that, like some of those other guys did. And I think that for him, it really did mean a lot to him to leave this program in this state, and also just for him individually, given his journey. I kind of joked with him, I guess that was on Friday, where it's like, all right, Jair, we're asking you that question again.
Yeah.
We're another step closer. What's this been like? Going back to, been asking him the same question since Indianapolis 5 months ago. So I think that he is someone who, really wanted this game, and I think it showed in how he played. But I mean, with Nick Singleton, sometimes I'm right. Before the game, we were down on the sideline, and I posted a picture of Nick Singleton and said that I felt like I was expecting a big day from him. I said it on the podcast pregame, and he only needed 7 carries to get those 2 touchdowns, which was just another really impressive day from him. I think that what he did yesterday really kind of solidifies what we've been talking about him as that 5-star talent who can really just change a play, on a dime. It only takes one play. That run that he had, the left side of the offensive line did a great job opening a hole. Theo Johnson finished it off. I think Singleton might have thrown a little stiff arm in there.
I give Nick Singleton about 25% credit for that defender going down. Theo Johnson, the rest of it. And that was the only contact that Nick made with the defender on the run.
And then once he got
all game.
Yeah. And then he was gone. It was, he had so much green out in front of him, and you just knew that no one was going to catch him. And it's been a long time since Penn State has had that in the running game. And I think that really showed him in a big way. I mean, that's the type of guy in these types of games, when you get into the New Year's Six, when you get into the college football playoff, that you need guys that can really lift the level, make things happen on their own. And Singleton showed that. So I feel like he'd done a pretty good job of making himself a known quantity throughout the college football world throughout the year. The Auburn game was obviously really big for him, but I think that this might have kind of taken it to another level. And I know that, Tyler, you talked to G. Scruggs after the game, and he definitely thinks so.
Yeah, I said, what does the future look like? And Juice said, I see a Heisman. And I will say this now, this is the beauty of talking to guys who are leaving the program, and maybe there's a little more cautious approach, I think, with guys who are kind of going to be within the locker room moving forward. They don't want to necessarily put that on guys, but I think Juice Scruggs kind of speaks for probably a lot of people, even if they're not going to tell us on the record how they feel about Nick Singleton. And the tricky part here is that it's not a tricky part. It's a beautiful thing. It's a luxury, but you've got Kaytron Allen, who's going to be a piece of the puzzle here. 1,000-yard rusher, Nick Singleton. He's only the second freshman to do that in Penn State history. Saquon Barkley was the other true freshman to do that. But when you look at what he was able to accomplish, it didn't require more than 17 carries in 12 of 13 games. So you're talking about, you look across the country and you say, wow, this freshman did a great job. Dig a little bit deeper into those stats, and you might see the guy was taxed for 25 to 30 touches per game. What does that mean for him going into next year? What does that mean for him coming out of junior year? And Penn State's always done a really good job, it seems, of balancing guys, getting them off to the NFL without a ton of that tread on their tire, at least in the modern era of Penn State football. They did it with Saquon. They certainly did it with Miles Sanders. And oh, by the way, first time a running back has gone over 1,000 yards since Miles Sanders did it back in 2018. Mark, you've covered so many tremendous running backs with this program, a bunch of whom selected very highly in the NFL draft. We've been talking about it since you showed up into Happy Valley in January. Every step of the way, the feedback is the kid's a pro. He's going to put himself in a position. It got confirmed that he was going to be a key part of this roster. He's starting by the end of September, and now he's getting 120 yards and a couple touchdowns. He had that 5-yard run to start things off late in the first quarter in terms of points. 7 touches to get all that done. Where do you think it goes from here for Nick, and how maybe would you compare his early progress to those you've seen in the past?
Well, most of the guys I saw in the past didn't play as true freshmen. Kajana Carter actually was thinking about transferring after his freshman year, if you could believe that. That was just a different era. But before Saquon, I would say Kajana, who had a long run of his own in the Rose Bowl for a touchdown, which is a great story in its own right, because as our friend Goon would tell us, the offensive line blocked all the wrong people on that play in the 94 Rose Bowl, and Kajana somehow sprung it. But he was a 7.8 yard per carry guy in 94, 7.2 for his career. Nick is at what, 6.7, 6.8 this year?
6.8 finished that.
Those are like huge numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you go and look at the great Penn State running backs, once you get up, there aren't many over 6. I don't know if you could bring it up, but that is special territory. To me, Saquon has been the best running back so far. One, because he was playing with a not so great offensive line. 2, because he was a dominant return man, and 3, because he was an awesome receiver as well. He did all of those things. So to me, it's Saquon, it's Kajana, and you could probably toss those 2 up. I know other people have other feelings. There have been other great backs, but from the ones I cover, those are the ones I liked. One thing after the game that I thought was really cool, I don't know if you guys got a chance to see it on Brennan Cam, but I'm telling you, people watch this Brennan Cam. There is a moment where LeVar Arrington hugs Singleton, and I was able to hear what he was saying. He said, "You're a bad man." And that's a takeoff of Ali after he beat Sonny Liston when he said, "I'm a bad man." But so LeVar has an appreciation, and then LeVar he had his Hall of Fame ring on, which I guess if I'm in the Hall of Fame, I'd be wearing that everywhere that I could go to. And Singleton looks down at the ring, and LeVar said, "You're going to get you one of these. You're going to get you one of these." I mean, it is a pretty cool moment. I have to like cut that out and stick it somewhere on social media. I'll let the intern handle that. Things were so busy, but that's what you're talking about. LeVar Arrington just doesn't go over to people and say that kind of thing. I mean, he's a straight shooter. He's a great guy, but what is it? Greatness knows greatness, or whatever it is. That's what we're talking about. That's the level. But one other thing on this, and I see where you brought Katron Allen up. I mean, look at the stats. Singleton 7 carries, Katron 11 carries. So Katron, there were many games where he was getting more carries. And, so I think there is a way to keep both of these guys happy, keep them healthy. And, to me, I guess the wild card here is what's going to happen with Kevon Lee. But in terms of those 2 guys, it seems like they have a pretty good working relationship. Both of them talked about being friends. Both of them talked about working together well in the running back room. And I think this is another area where we really have to give a shout out to Jaywan Sider for number 1, being a great recruiter. Number 2, being able to balance this kind of talent.
Nick Singleton on the season, 156 carries. Katron Allen, 167. So there you go. And Katron finished with more starts on the year. Both of these guys finished with Big Ten Player of the Weeks. Of course, Singleton was the Big Ten Freshman of the Year. You want to talk about building that Hall of Fame resume someday, young man? That's a hell of a start. Year 1, you're the Big Ten Freshman of the Year. You score 14 touchdowns. In doing so, you set a Penn State record. And then you go 87 for one of your 2 touchdowns in the Rose Bowl.
Yeah, 14 on how many carries? Do that. Who knows math? Who knows how to do the math stuff? That's a touchdown every however many carries, and it's not many.
Yeah, and the impressive thing is Singleton scored those in 3 different ways: as a receiver, as a kick returner, as a rusher. Really excited to see what goes on for him. And Katron Allen finishing his season with 11 touchdowns in his own right. That would have been a Penn State freshman record. And by the way, there were no rushing touchdowns from the running back position last year. These 2 guys alone had 24 rushing touchdowns combined. So it's really going to be special to see how it moves forward, because I know the conversation is about Drew Aller, and here he comes, and he's going to be a bad man too, and everyone wants to buy into that. But the weapons that you have in place around him are really special. And forget the weapons for a second. How about the big fellas? I was hoping that maybe James Franklin would open his first statement of this game and be like, "I'm ready to talk about the offensive line." We'll get there with him. He'll eventually give us the rise of this group in 2020.
That was a terrible post-game situation. We can get into it on another podcast, but very disappointed in the way that went.
If Mark Brennan's not getting a question to James Franklin and he's sitting in front of him at the Rose Bowl, it clearly didn't work out as it's supposed to.
They had people in different areas. I mean, it just that was less than ideal.
Well, we all live in town. We'll be back to face to face.
I had to get that off my chest. All right.
We'll get back of it. We'll talk to these guys again soon. But Daniel, getting back to the offensive front, because it wasn't Olu Fashanu, which we were expecting down to the wire. We didn't see him on the practice field. Haven't seen him since October in terms of practice action when we've gotten looks. So look, Drew Shelton, 5th start in a row at left tackle. Caden Wallace back on the field. Bryce Effner got the start there, but I think it's fair to say they were back into a really equal share rotation. I got to check out the snap counts, but Caden Wallace was out there for a big stretch in the 3rd quarter and 4th quarter when they're putting up a bunch of points. He's back. We talked about that last episode. The only guy from this mix that we know is gone is Juice Scruggs, the starting center. And Bryce Effner, we're not quite sure on that. He's one of those names we got to figure things out with. I mean, what do you think about this? Because like Nick Singleton did, very much crediting his offensive line. The left side of that line got it done on his run. James Franklin had the confidence in this offense that he could get the crease with Nick Singleton. They had the kind of setup we saw looking to the sideline, showing some confusion like they did in the Fiesta Bowl with Saquon a few years back, and they got him. You got to have an offensive line that can handle those kind of assignments and handle those responsibilities. And I just feel like the play calling reflects that confidence. And with a month to get into this game, really showed, I think, where they think they can go and what they think they are right now with this group.
I think we're all waiting for that James Franklin victory lap.
Yeah, he can take it.
The offensive line, and we'll let it last as long as it needs to. It can be 3 laps if he wants it to be. The offensive line I felt like it played very well. It just came along so nicely, and when you spin things ahead to next year, it just feels like it's in such a good place. We talked about it earlier this year, where in 2021, it felt like the offensive line could only go 6 deep, where Bryce Effner was the only guy that they felt really comfortable with bringing in.
Feels like a long time ago, doesn't it?
It does. And then this year, you were able to go 7 deep with Effner, and then the addition of Hunter Norzad. And now when you look ahead to next year, even if Effner leaves with Juice leaving, you have these younger guys that got valuable experience, where someone like Drew Shelton, immediately pencils in as one of the first guys off the bench. You had some guys like J.D. Nelson and Venga Ioane who got reps this year. Like it feels like next year maybe they can go 8 deep. You're never going to be able to get a real 2 deep across an offensive line at any level of football, just because they don't make that many men that large that can do those types of things, and it's hard to get that many people in one place. But I think what Phil Trautwein has done is just build a room that has really come along, that is flexible, that's big and strong, and I think that it really shows. As good as Nick Singleton is, as good as Kaytron Allen is, I think that having this offensive line play the way it did this year, it just made them that much better. It allowed them to do that many more things, and I think that this future is really bright. We were kind of waiting for it to kick into gear, and I think that what you saw this year, especially when you look at it in the context of Drew Shelton being able to come in as a freshman, what they were saying about Venga Ioane as a freshman, and then looking at this next incoming group in the class of 2023 and what the expectations are, it's easy to feel good about the offensive line right now.
And as we were kind of just bringing you up to speed on the status of some guys from a health standpoint and Fashanu and with Caden Wallace, we did not see Kevon Lee on the field. Our understanding was he was available to play. That's what James Franklin said heading into the matchup. He ultimately did not play for the remaining 7 games of this season after he played against Michigan back in mid-October. So certainly some questions about him heading into year number 4 at the college level with those 2 freshman running backs. But there's also a question about if he were to move on. You're in an interesting spot here because you've got a couple freshmen coming in. One's coming off an injury. Neither are on campus until the summer. So Kevon Lee is a name to monitor again moving forward. And by the time you hear this podcast, maybe he has gone public with what he wants to do. That's kind of where we're at with this week moving forward.
Could you clear up the 4-game situation with him too? Because there was some confusion on the message board about that. That some people were suggesting he didn't play due to the redshirt, but the rule has changed.
Right.
In that.
Right. And he was already at 5.
So
it's a moot point. He played in the first 5 games. Remember, he started, I believe, the first 2, scored the game-winning touchdown in the first one. Right. If he was on that 4-game seesaw, the
red shirt wasn't in play.
The red shirt wasn't in play. But that's not going to be the situation for Kevon Lee. But we won't spend much time on him because it's the Rose Bowl and he didn't factor into it. And so that's no offense to Kevon. It's just that's where the focus is right now. And somebody who we were wondering, would they answer the bell, have a moment? And he did against Michigan State, and he did again against Utah, was Keandre Lambert-Smith, finishing off his 3rd year on campus as well. He's still got a lot to answer for, especially because I know in his mind and where he wants to be in 2023, it's going to be the leading receiver for this team. Not to say that he's going to elbow other guys out of the way, but I think he sees himself as taking that next step. And I mean, it's hard to argue with the way he finished, and a big chunk of it, of course, this 3-catch, 124-yard, 1 touchdown performance was an 88-yard touchdown Rose Bowl history here for Penn State's offense. First time you've had a team go 80-plus touchdown, 80-plus through the air and on the ground. Mark, you have pretty pointedly talked about Keandre Lambert-Smith needing to take that step. You mentioned it a couple times going into this game. He checked it off the box in a big way, and he showed off that playmaking ability.
Yeah, and all credit to him. Hey, things got real for him.
Mm-hmm.
That Penn State was very vocal that wide receiver was a spot that they had to address in the transfer portal, and sure enough, they did address it in the transfer portal with Devin Carter. I'm sorry, but yeah, I mean, I think when you hear that, Parker Washington's moving on, Mitchell Tinsley's moving on, and now they're saying they need to address wide receiver in the portal. I think maybe he took that as a little bit of a challenge, that it's time for me to finally step up. Listen, the talent's always been there, right? The speed, the pass catching ability, the moves. It's just a consistency that's not been. And I think as I look at this game, clearly Clifford playing well was huge for them. But I think the fact that Keandre Lambert-Smith stepped up and it wasn't just that, he made multiple nice catches, key catches in that game. I think he was one of the guys who really benefited from being able to get things done on this sort of big stage. It's one thing to do something against a Michigan State team that's struggling. It's another thing to do it in a game like this where you basically deliver the dagger against a top 10 opponent. So good for him. I'm guessing, knowing the way this coaching staff operates, I'm guessing they challenged him, in a good way.
Taylor Stubblefield has done it publicly repeatedly. Yeah. So I'd imagine behind closed doors, from what I understand about Stubblefield, now he coaches, there have been some very open conversations.
But isn't it good when you see a kid respond like this to that? So
of course.
I think all of a sudden now you have a guy, now he's getting it done on the field. Is he going to be able to step up as a leader in this room? We've all had an opportunity to talk to him. Very smart kid, very well spoken. But leadership's not always an easy thing. But to me, that's the next important step in his development with the guys who are moving on.
We have more on this at Lions247.com. From the night of the Rose Bowl, we had some transfer portal news of all times to get it, by the way. But they are bringing in Devin Carter from NC State, an experienced wide receiver, played a lot for the Wolfpack. We'll get to him and some of the other transfer stuff later on in the week as we kind of settle in after the bowl discussion. But there is help on the way at wide receiver. We know that. And Keandre Lambert-Smith, though, and his potential emergence, major storyline here. And I can tell you, speaking with him after the game, exuding confidence, he said it was very important for him to cross off on his personal list that first 100-yard receiving game. This is the end of his third full season on campus. This is a guy who I know showed up on campus thinking he was going to put up some big numbers and build off of them. He kind of flirted with that a little bit last year, but goes for 124 in this matchup. As we said, a bulk of that. But Daniel, this is going to be key off the field. He said Drew Aller is someone he needs to spend a ton of time with. He wants to build that chemistry. He said the same thing about Bo Prabula. But he really said this is an offseason where he's gonna, he thinks they can win a national championship. He thinks that he can be a central figure in that, a leading receiver in that. And sounds like a guy who, coming off of this, and from what we understand, someone who really requires a level of confidence. Coming off of this, sounds like he wants to start like Tuesday morning. Hey, Drew, let's go have a catch, which is great news for Keandre Lambert, and it's fantastic news for this receiver room.
Maybe they've already gotten some reps in.
Yes, yes.
I think that when you look at this team moving forward, wide receiver is kind of the big question mark right now on offense. Obviously, in a way, Aller is a question mark because anytime you have a first-time starter, you need to know how he's going to respond. But just from a personnel perspective, looking at the numbers at wide receiver, who's there? Keandre Lambert-Smith is the guy coming back, and I think this should be a good springboard for him. James Franklin said it after the game that this probably hasn't gone the way that he thought it did this year. I think Keandre said it himself back in November when we were on Zoom with him that this isn't really how he envisioned his third year. Last year, Taylor Stubblefield had talked kind of about Keandre needing to continue this sort of linear progression, and that didn't happen this year. But I think that if he can take this type of performance and really spin it forward, I think that really bodes well for Penn State. I mean, even beyond the big 88-yard touchdown, I thought that one of my favorite plays of the game was, I think it was a 32-yarder where Clifford is rolling out to his left, throws across his body, and Lambert Smith is able to be open on the sideline and pull it in. That sort of off-schedule play by a wide receiver who, we've talked about, needing to have confidence, really needing to be engaged. I think it was really, really big. And I think that if you're seeing that type of play from Keandre Lambert Smith, that shows that he's locked in. He's part of the offense, and he's really able to make plays there. So, I liked what I saw out of him last night. The Michigan State game, we kind of talked about it like, all right, is this actually the springboard for him? And it looks like that he did take a lot from that, and it looks like he's building on that.
That was the other thing Keandre and I discussed, was like just stringing together games right now, because that has been tough for him to do. It's been a game and then not a disappearing act, but kind of a non-factor situation in terms of the box score and production for 2 or 3 games. Then it might pop up. This was back-to-back games. And just to put it in context, guys, through the first 11 games, he did miss one of those 11 games of this season. 16 catches, 182 yards, 2 touchdowns in the final 2 games of the season for Keandre Lambert Smith. 8 catches for 207 yards, 2 touchdowns. So there's a lot to build off and like about the way he finished. You got things to build off with Harrison Wallace, but there are so many unknown commodities. Liam Clifford got some significant run in the Rose Bowl. We saw Caden Saunders gain some experience in a setting like that, which is going to help him out. But that tight end room, let's quickly look there before we shift gears and focus on some defensive success in the Rose Bowl. You had Tyler Warren come up with another grab on his lone target of the day for 15 yards. You had Theo Johnson do something that he's just been doing a bunch of. It's 6 times now in 7 games where he goes for 25 plus on a reception. That's not normal for the tight end position. And Theo has been a guy that, even if it's not a big volume for him, he's been a splashy playmaker at a position that's usually light on those kind of guys. Brenton Strange held out of the stat sheet in his final game in a Nittany Lions uniform. Of course, he's contributing as a blocker. We all know how effective he was there. But I think this peeled back the curtain a little bit on the future at tight end. And just, again, reiterating, Theo Johnson does things at tight end that are very much valued. And I want to reemphasize, he's a guy we got to wait on. I don't know when you're listening to this podcast, but I am personally just want to double check. I think I know where Theo's leaning. I think we'll be covering him in 2023. He mentioned as such to some of our colleagues who reported that. But I'm just not convinced until I see it, because he's a tantalizing prospect.
Yeah, I also think that he was banged up early in the year. I mean, we barely saw him early in the season, but once he started producing, boy, was he producing. And I just wonder if he's one of these guys, if he gets an entire season on tape for pro scouts. Obviously, Daniel has mentioned this, that I think whenever he goes to the combine, he's going to be a guy who tests extremely well, because he's bigger than you imagine people. I mean, if you've not been by him, I mean, he's 6'6" and 265, 270, and it's like legit. And he runs extremely well for that size. So whenever he goes to the combine, he's going to test well, and
he will interview You might wonder about, okay, he's a redshirt sophomore. Is he ready to sit across from an NFL scout or an NFL general manager? Yes, he would be. And I still think, though, to your point, full year of film, he might be tight end. I mean, I think there's a very good chance he's tight end 1. Although, there's a very good one down in Athens, Georgia. Right.
But that's my point. Even if you're in that top 1 or 2, I mean, you're talking about guys who have an opportunity to go in the first round. Yeah. I mean, as I look at this team and who's coming back next year, and you look at the NFL potential, and this is, I'm sure, fodder for another podcast, but I mean, he's got to be right up there, kind of toward the top of the list. I mean, obviously, Olu is going to be there, but I just. Yeah, from the physical standpoint, from the athleticism, and from the intelligence. But yeah, I'm for our sake, I'm hoping he comes back, because I think it'll be fun to cover him for another year. But whatever decision he makes is going to be what's best for him. But he is that caliber. And then, I expected more out of Tyler Warren this year, and I think.
Injuries are definitely a factor.
He was banged up, and I completely get it. They don't want to share info on injuries, and nor should they. I think you're making a mistake if you do that, because you're only giving the opponent an advantage. But he was able to grind his way through, and I still stand by that. When he's 100%, he has a chance to be an NFL caliber receiver too. Now, where do you go after that with Jerry Cross and Khalil Dinkins? Didn't see much, if any, of either of them this year. I think there's potential there. We're just not positive, but I think if you're able to start with that too, with the if your nucleus is Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren, I think there are much worse places to start from.
And check this, as of right now, as things stand, they would have two tight ends coming back who had 10-plus catches in Tyler Warren and Theo Johnson. That's what the wide receiver room has coming back. Two players who have 10-plus catches this year. So, you think about how many guys are in the tight end room versus how many guys are in the wide receiver room. You're in a good spot from experience. I think Dinkins has made the progress. So is Jerry Cross as a freshman. And they've got one of the best tight end classes in the country. And I think Andrew Rappleyea is the kind of maybe early impact player that could work his way. But looking back to Monday night, because here we are on a Tuesday after, and we're already like, okay, 2023, this is the nature of things. But the way things capped off, we've made it a long way before getting to how this defense performed. And of course, giving up 2 touchdowns in the second quarter, when we saw these teams go back and forth, it was 4 consecutive possessions that resulted in touchdowns. But it felt like when Penn State was able to step up, produce a splash in that third quarter in the form of Nick Singleton, who, by the way, again, Theo Johnson, big block on that. I didn't even mention what he did as a blocker on that play. But when you look forward, and it felt like they were starting to beat up Utah, particularly the quarterback, physically really did it and knocked him out of the game. But it felt like outside of a few runs, they were the superior opponent on the perimeter, on the edge, and Utah was left trying to fend for itself in the middle of the field like we thought they were going to try to attack. And Penn State, after a couple quarters of missed tackles, bludgeoned their way to taking control of this thing with the big help from the offensive plays.
It did feel like that Penn State, it was going to be a matter of time before they started getting home on Cam Rising. There were some plays early on. Cam Rising was also pretty slippery in the pocket. He was able to get out, gain some yards with his legs, which ultimately came back to bite him a little bit. But it did feel like guys like Adisa Isaac, Chop Robinson, there was going to be pressure. Jair Brown, fantastic blitzer, someone who was had 1.5 sacks, but definitely could have had 2.5 or even 3.5 with some of the plays he made in the backfield.
And Curtis.
Can't forget Curtis Jacobs' 2 sacks. He didn't know he had 2 sacks.
He didn't know he had 2 sacks.
I keep forgetting he had 2 sacks. But
he was very so. Just the backstory. I asked Curtis. So 2 sacks. What's that performance like? He said, I had 2 sacks. And these are the fun things you can do when you're face to face again that you can really do a lot on Zoom. And I'm like, yeah. And he was so excited. And I was like, congrats, man. His face lit up. So, and another guy, we just don't know yet. Maybe you do by the time you hear this. Maybe we all do. But Curtis Jacobs, if you were looking for a guy to kind of, hey, look what I can do in a big stage, he was able to get that done. Although I will say it wasn't a clean performance from Curtis. I think he left some things out there as Utah was running the ball, but a couple sacks and some action in the backfield.
They definitely left something to be desired from a tackling perspective from Penn State. But with a month-long layoff, there's maybe some footing. And also, Jaquindon Jackson and Mekhi Bernard were both pretty good running backs. They were fun to watch when they got into space. But, I thought that the Penn State defense played really well. You saw that secondary that even without Joey Porter Jr., I think Kalen King announced himself a little bit as a player to know. He made a great play, diving catch on an interception where he ran the route almost better than the wide receiver did. He also had a good tackle on a 3rd down to stop a wide receiver short of the sticks.
He's a pretty excellent open field tackler. We're going to talk so much about the coverage numbers, and that was the big story with Joey. I think if you're going to make a case for him being a more complete cornerback, that's probably where the conversation starts.
The job that I keep going back to that Ohio State game where Ohio State kept trying to do the bubble screens to Emeka Egbuka, and Kalen King was just rocketing up past the line of scrimmage, getting him behind the backfield. I think there was one point in the game, Egbuka had like 3 catches for 2 yards or something along those lines. But I think that Kalen King is a really complete cornerback at that size, 5'11", 189. I don't necessarily know if NFL scouts look at that like cornerback 1 type frame, but I think that it's hard to argue with this production and also just with watching the tape, what he's able to do. So, I thought that it was a really good And, we saw kind of all the different parts of the defense that have shined at different times this year, all kind of showed up, had their moment.
When I look at the possession chart here for Utah, they had that big 7+ minute touchdown drive, which was coming off an interception that led to a Penn State touchdown. You're thinking that's a really nice response from Utah. They seem like they're settled in. They took 13 plays to do it. Again, when you're going half a quarter of work on offense, made me wonder, okay, is Penn State going to get punched in the mouth here in a way that we haven't seen since October? And how are they going to respond defensively? And Mark, a big part of this to me was their ability to play with 20 to 24 deep. And we've seen it since week 1. Jalen Reed goes off the field, returns in a sling. I think by the end of the first quarter, he's wearing a sling on his right arm. Bad way to end the season for a sophomore who played the second most snaps at safety. Kalen King was out of the picture for a little bit. In fact, on a drive where Utah had some success downfield. But it felt like you could go too deep at every position and feel like you were okay. And that added up, I felt like, as the game progressed, specifically when you lose a playmaker at quarterback like Utah did. And depth, to me, the complete performance. I know you can spotlight some really strong individual play, but that's been the story since week 1. And under Manny Diaz, as they've continued to get better, it's just a collective effort.
Yeah, I mean, Johnny Dixon also had to come off for a couple of snaps too. So as thin as they were at cornerback, that makes you, again, that much more impressive. You look at the numbers, and the time of possession was just ridiculous in Utah's favor. But I still think, and I wrote this, that I thought they went away from the run, especially when Rising was hurt. I mean, when you adjust for sacks, so for people who don't know, sack numbers in college football, the numbers come away from the rushing total, which is different than the NFL. And I think that's a dumb way to do it.
Yeah, it's dumb.
Yeah. So if you take away the sacks, which is a big if, but adjusted for sacks, the Utes average 6.1 yards per carry. Okay, when adjusted for sacks, so if you counted the sack yardage against the passing yardage the way the NFL does, which is the way everybody should do it, Utah averaged 3.6 yards per pass attempt. And, my thought is that if you have a chance of beating this Penn State defense, and what did Michigan do? I mean, Michigan ran the ball like crazy and was the one team that was really able to wear them out. And I'm not suggesting that Utah could have blown out Penn State, but I think they could have made it more competitive by grinding and hoping that Penn State would get tired. Daniel mentioned earlier, and you touched on it, some of the issues with tackling, and then I wonder if they got if Utah – Penn State didn't get a sack, I don't think, until late in the first half. And then they come through with 5 in the second half. And they clearly figured something out. And then when the backup quarterback was in there, that guy couldn't move at all, so he was done. I just think they got away. They have good running backs. I thought they got away from the run. But having said all that, what you're saying is exactly right. I mean, Manny Diaz and James Franklin were committed to playing a lot of players early in the game. Early in the season on defense. We saw it at Purdue. We saw it at Auburn. We saw it in all those early season games. The Purdue game was close, and they were running second and third team guys out there late in the game.
And afterward, James said, get used to it.
Yep. And we did, and it paid off. And, I just think the job Manny Diaz did this year, I thought was tremendous. I thought the whole coaching staff, I mean, really, you could look at guys, Yursich to me was a guy who was deservedly under some fire. And as the season went along, it all came together. Troutwine obviously was under fire. That came together. But over on defense, the impact that Manny Diaz had, just with the overall aggressiveness of that group and the willingness to go deep and play a lot of guys. I really like that. And I thought it served them well.
They've got 2 successful coordinators in place right now, and I wasn't sure if you'd be able to apply that label to Mike Yursich halfway through the season, just like we weren't sure how Penn State would respond to some of that adversity. And if you want to talk about maybe a figure within this program, at least from my perspective, who I'm viewing from a different lens here in January 2023 than I was before the season or after last season, or halfway through this one, it's Mike Yurcich, what he was able to do and adjust and tailor things toward the newer strengths of this offense that weren't strength of this offense last year. And you got to give him some credit for whether it was comfortable or not, or whether it was always an easy decision for him or not, his commitment and his relationship with Sean Clifford. And I think that was a huge role in the last few weeks in making sure we saw such a polished Sean Clifford, because when you're putting out an offense in the Rose Bowl and you're a coordinator, you want to make sure you're proud of what ends up there. And it's a big moment for his career. I think that the second half of this season for Mike Yurcich, and he'll now have a launch pad situation for him in his career at still a relatively young age, because they got a lot of exciting pieces, national star type players, eyeballs on this offense, a lot of NFL scouts watching this offense, and you're going to have this fancy, shiny 5-star prospect stepping up that you personally recruited to campus. So there's a lot in place, and I just wanted to make sure we took some time, like you said, to acknowledging the coaching staff as a whole. We've been critical of Mike Yurcich at times on this podcast, and I think it's been warranted during those times, but you've always said you want to see what it looks like. You want to see it with more time, and a lot of the conversation has been you want to see what it looks like when it's with the quarterback that he has brought to campus. Drew's not here without Mike Yurcich, and you want to give them a chance. And I think ultimately the way they finished out with Sean Clifford and with some of these young emerging pieces gives you a lot of optimism of where it could be heading. And Daniel, as we finish up the conversation here, we have so much to kind of look back on still from this past season, things we're going to look ahead toward. It's going to be a fun part of the calendar here on the podcast and with our coverage, because we get some time to sit down, catch our breath, and expand on things. But in this game, unsung moments, unsung heroes, beyond the fact that we all freaking love Pasadena and can't wait to get back there for another Rose Bowl, absolutely lived up to the hype. What are you taking away in your back pocket as we get toward moving back to the East Coast here?
Yeah, I think I just go to the fact that Penn State has reestablished itself and found its footing. You talk a lot about where it was after 2019 and the steps back and trying to get back to that point. And I do feel like that they're there. And now that the big key is you have to make that happen. You're really, they are setting expectations very high for themselves. And I think that's what you want. You want this team to believe that what they're capable of accomplishing. But I also think that they kind of know what's ahead, that there's a kind of a level of seriousness about what they need to do to accomplish these things. Theo Johnson on last week had a good comment where he agrees that they can accomplish big things, but he also said that there's a mentality that goes into it now where if you've gotten this far, but it's so hard to break into that next tier that it's going to take a lot of work, and you have to want it, and you have to really put that in. So I think that was kind of a big takeaway, that this Rose Bowl win is really nice, and that it's something that they really wanted, but at the same time, I think that they know that they're capable of a little bit more, and I think that they really believe that they can do that. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But overall, I just thought it was a good game that kind of hit a lot of the beats of the season. Kind of like what I just talked about with the defense, where it seemed like each position group kind of had its moment. You had the pass rush getting home. You had the linebackers making a couple good plays. You had Jair Brown getting an interception in his final game, which you knew meant a lot to him. You had Kalen King making a play. You had a big Nick Singleton play. You kind of had the hits, so to speak, from the season. And I thought that kind of made for a pretty complete and comprehensive performance. I don't really think that the Cam Rising injury is that big of an asterisk. I thought that Penn State was starting to pull away, and maybe it's still a 14-point game if Cam Rising doesn't get hurt, but I don't think there's garbage time if he doesn't get hurt. But, Penn State did what they had to do, and they won, and I thought that it was a very, satisfying end to the 22 season for them.
You talked about getting back to where they were, and Mark's mentioned that a bunch of times. I thought what stood out to me is in the post-game availability, it was a player like Juice Scruggs who is moving on from the program. It maybe feels a little bit more free to say some of these things, but the expectation you said for 2023 for Penn State is to compete for a national championship. Curtis Jacobs said the same thing. We heard younger members of this roster say the goal is to win a national title next year. And they said it with a straight face. They said it with conviction. Don't think we could have heard that with conviction after 2020 or heading into spring of 2021 or working our way out of last season down in Orlando. If a player had said that in the locker room, it would have been picked up a little bit differently. It would have been perceived differently. Now I think people are hearing it. We're writing about it. They're saying it, and no one's sneezing at it. Now, to win a national championship, you got to go through some incredible teams. We saw how difficult that task was just a few days ago for Ohio State and Michigan. But that party's going to open soon. But this team knows it's only 4, and they're still saying national title. Mark, that to me is where the mindset has shifted. The culture is in a really good spot coming out of this. You got to hope it survives and keep it intact. You're going to lose some key leaders. You may lose some surprises to the portal. That's always in play. Your goal right now is to get on the field come spring ball and still have the same vibes across the group when they put those pads back on.
Yeah, it's hard to get to this level once.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you slip back the way Penn State did through the COVID years, that's a difficult thing. But then to reestablish it, as you said, I mean, to get here again, I think that says a lot about the coaches. I think it says a lot about the veteran players. Where do they go from here? I mean, I think we touched on it throughout the podcast. It was huge that so many guys opted into this game and that they that they were rewarded for it, that the program was rewarded for it. What message does that send to future teams? But to be able to leave this program at least where they found it after everything that happened through those 2 years, I think was just gigantic. You mentioned the word culture. That's huge anymore. It's bigger than it's ever been, because if you don't have a positive culture, you are going to be bleeding players left and right. And knock on wood for Penn State, they haven't done that so far. Now, are we naive enough to think that there may not be people popping into the portal? That could very well happen. It may happen by the time people listen to this. Who knows? But I think if you compare what's gone on at Penn State to what's gone on at a lot of different other programs, Penn State is in a very good spot. And I think that speaks to the culture. A little thing like Joey Porter Jr. coming back for this game, a little thing like Parker Washington deciding to still be part of the team. Could he have gone and worked out for his legs and stuff? No, but he could have worked on his upper body. He could have been at, somewhere where the weather was actually nice as opposed to LA this week. But I think those things, the Nick Tarburtons, the Brenton Stranges, the Juice Scruggses, the veteran players opting into the game. That to me speaks to the culture, and that's what you're going to need to compete for the title. You are going to need that, because if you start having significant turnover every year, it's going to be very difficult to do that. So I think they're in a good place culture-wise. Let's see if they can maintain it. But to be able to get back to this spot after where they were following 2021, and after where they were, circling back to what I said early in this podcast, where they were in late October of this year, I think is just gigantic for the program.
Yeah, and it felt like the last 2.5 months of last year left a lot of questions. Although along the way, James Franklin got that contract extension and locked in long term. They created so many questions that you got to answer on the recruiting trail. You've got to answer within your locker room. You've got to answer when you wake up in the morning and look in the mirror. And it felt like in the last 2.5 months of this season, they found a lot of stabilizing factors, and they found the track that they want to be on. And we'll see if they can keep on it, because it's going to create a lot of excitement heading towards next September. There's no doubt about it. Now you got to actually live up to those expectations, because they have been lifted again for Penn State, coming off of a 35-21 victory over number 8 Utah. This ensures the Nittany Lions are going to finish with a top 10 ranking this season. That says a lot coming off of a span where you're 11-11 over a couple of years. And one thing that stood out to me, guys, that I think was a nice peek into the culture of this room was chatting with Mitch Tinsley after this matchup. I mentioned on the pregame podcast, this was a dream come true. 0 scholarships coming out of high school. Loved watching the Rose Bowl. Saw it as a level he couldn't get to. He had his pick of the litter, Florida State. Teams in the SEC. He had USC, in fact, offered him a scholarship in the transfer portal. He picked Penn State. Didn't have explosive numbers, but in this game, he was the number one target in terms of 8 targets on the day. That was actually double of what Keandre Lambert-Smith saw. He had 49 yards on 6 catches and a touchdown. He reached the end zone in the Rose Bowl and led a top 10 team nationally. And he will come out of this experience and he will pick up the phone for James Franklin and call anyone who asks and say, go to Penn State. I did. It was a huge decision. So will Chop Robinson. Yeah. And there's a lot of guys across college football making knee-jerk decisions based on maybe things that they shouldn't be trusting, things that aren't necessarily data points, things that look great right now, maybe for the next 12 months. And Penn State, I think right now, what you're hearing from the guys who are coming here and hearing the pitch and then experiencing it, Chop Robinson is loving life. He was all smiles last night. And a guy like Mitchell Tinsley, who really had an important decision, 1 year to make the most of it. I think he feels like he's going off to the pros with, 1, a tremendous college football experience, but 2, the springboard that he was looking for when he put his name in the transfer portal last year. And so I just wanted to share that little anecdote because really cool for Mitchell Tinsley. And I think a little bit of a kind of a peek behind the curtain of how Penn State is operating right now. So I think that's it. I think that we've run out of things to say. Yeah, I think we've run out of things to say.
Well, we also have to check out of the hotel and
we got to get out of here. They're going to kick us out.
We've been here too long.
But it's been a great covering the Rose Bowl with you guys.
Yeah,
awesome. I mean, it's been great covering the team with both of you all season long. Done it with you, Mark, now for about half a decade. But Daniel, first time on board, it's been awesome. Well, Tyler Calvaruso has been holding down the fort for us, chipping up some basketball coverage during the week, but. Great time here in the Rose Bowl, and I think it's safe to say that we're entering an offseason where conversation is going to be about the college football playoff, and it's up to Penn State to prove people right or to prove people wrong again. But it's going to be fun having those conversations with you guys here in the podcast and on the content to come at Lions247.com.
We'll see you guys both back in Pennsylvania because
right.
None of us are going to have any travel issues. It's going to go smoothly.
Smooth as can be. And we'll be back a little bit later here in the week with our first episode, or our first episode that looks a little bit ahead beyond the Rose Bowl. We'll talk about these transfer portal additions that Penn State has added and get to the latest on the recent roster maneuvers as Penn State's about to welcome in these early enrollees in a matter of just days. So things move forward fast in college football, but fun to take some time, reflect on the experience in Pasadena. A ton of coverage up at Lions247.com. Thanks to all of our loyal listeners for sticking with us throughout this entire season. 13 games in the books. For Daniel and Mark and our producer, Lance Glenn, I am Tyler Donohue. This has been the Lions247 Podcast.